March 27, 1945. The Belgian countryside near the German border lay shrouded in morning mist as 18-year-old Private First Class Marcus Williams pressed the accelerator of his Willys MB Jeep, rattling down a dirt road with supplies destined for a forward artillery position. The engine hummed its familiar rhythm, a sound that had become as natural to him as breathing over the past 7 months. Marcus believed this would be another routine supply run, just one more trip in a war that seemed to be winding down, just another day of keeping his head down and doing his duty in a segregated army that barely acknowledged his existence. He had no idea that in less than 2 hours, he would accomplish something that seasoned fighter pilots spent years training to achieve, and that his name would appear in official records with a distinction so unusual that military historians would debate its authenticity for decades to come. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how an unarmed teenager driving a supply vehicle became the only American soldier in the entire European theater to bring down an enemy aircraft using nothing but his Jeep, his wits, and a moment of impossible timing that would transform him from an invisible cog in the military machine into a legend whispered about in mess halls from Belgium to Berlin. Marcus Williams had arrived in Europe in August of 1944, part of the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company, a unit composed entirely of black soldiers under the command of white officers. The unit's designation number was no accident, and the men understood the dark humor behind it perfectly. They were nicknamed the 666, though Marcus preferred to think of them simply as the working heart of the Allied advance. While white infantry divisions received the glory and the newspaper coverage, units like his hauled the ammunition, the food, the medical supplies, and everything else that kept armies moving forward. The Jeep Marcus drove that morning was vehicle number 273, a standard Willys MB, painted in olive drab with a white star on the hood that was now so faded from months of use that it looked more gray than white. The vehicle had rolled off the assembly line in Toledo, Ohio in February of 1944, one of 361,518 such vehicles produced during the conflict. Marcus had been assigned to it in November, and in the 4 months since, he had driven it across 5 countries, through rain and snow and mud so thick it seemed determined to swallow the little vehicle whole. He knew every quirk of its 60-horsepower Go Devil engine, every grinding complaint from its 3-speed transmission, every squeak and rattle that announced their presence long before anyone could see them coming. The odometer showed 12,873 miles, each one a testament to endless hours of hauling supplies while more celebrated units pushed forward into history. The morning air carried the scent of wet earth and diesel fuel as Marcus navigated the narrow road. Behind him in the cargo bed sat 6 wooden crates of .30 caliber ammunition, 2 jerry cans of water, 1 box of medical supplies, and 3 canvas bags of mail that soldiers at the forward position had been waiting weeks to receive. The total weight was approximately 400 pounds, well within the Jeep's carrying capacity, but enough to make the suspension groan on every bump and pothole. Marcus had grown accustomed to the sounds of distant artillery, the rumble that never quite stopped even when no active engagement was taking place. It was the background music of their existence, as constant as the ticking of a clock. But this morning, something felt different, though he could not have explained exactly what or why. The mist was thicker than usual, reducing visibility to perhaps 200 yards. The road ahead disappeared into white nothingness, and Marcus found himself driving by memory as much as sight, following the track he had traveled 17 times in the past 3 weeks. His thoughts drifted to home, to Detroit, to the factory where his father worked making engine components for military vehicles, perhaps not unlike the one Marcus now drove. His mother's last letter, received 8 days ago, spoke of his younger sister Clara graduating from high school, of rationing finally easing a bit, of hope that the conflict would end soon and Marcus would come home. She had enclosed a photograph of the family standing on the front porch, everyone smiling despite his absence. Marcus kept it folded in his jacket pocket, the edges already worn soft from repeated handling. He had joined the army in July of 1943, 3 months after turning 17, with his parents' reluctant permission. The recruiter had painted pictures of adventure and opportunity, of serving his country and proving himself equal to any man. What the recruiter had not mentioned was that the army Marcus joined was as segregated as the Detroit neighborhoods where he grew up, that black soldiers were largely relegated to service and supply units, that their courage and capability would be constantly questioned, no matter what they accomplished. The 666th Quartermaster Truck Company had been activated at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in March of 1943. The unit consisted of 42 enlisted men and 4 officers, and their job was simple in concept, if exhausting in execution: keep supplies moving forward. They had landed at Utah Beach on July 4, 1944, exactly 1 month after the initial invasion, and since then had driven an estimated total of 1,300,000 miles across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and into Germany itself. Marcus had learned to drive on his uncle's farm outside Detroit, manning an old Ford pickup truck through fields and dirt roads from the age of 14. That experience had served him well in the army, where driving skill was valued, even if the driver himself was not. His commanding officer, Captain Robert Henderson, was a 32-year-old career officer from Virginia who treated his black soldiers with distant professionalism that Marcus had learned to interpret as the closest thing to respect he was likely to receive. The Jeep crested a small rise, and Marcus eased off the accelerator, letting gravity carry them down the other side. The mist was beginning to lift slightly, revealing patches of bare trees and muddy fields. This region had seen fighting as recently as February, when Allied forces pushed the German army back from the Ardennes. Evidence of that conflict still littered the landscape: abandoned equipment, hastily dug foxholes, trees splintered by explosions. Marcus had learned to read these signs like a language, understanding from their presence how recently the conflict had passed through and how intense it had been. A rabbit darted across the road, and Marcus instinctively touched the brake, a habit from civilian life that served little purpose in a military context, but one he had never quite abandoned. The rabbit disappeared into the underbrush, and Marcus smiled slightly, thinking it odd that wildlife continued their lives, seemingly oblivious to the human chaos surrounding them. Birds still sang, deer still grazed, and rabbits still ran, as if the outcome of battles meant nothing to the older rhythms of the natural world. The road curved right, and Marcus downshifted as he navigated the turn. According to his mental calculation, he was approximately 3 miles from the artillery position where he needed to deliver supplies. The position was manned by a dozen men from the 92nd Field Artillery Battalion, and Marcus had gotten to know several of them over his repeated supply runs. There was Corporal James Mitchell from Ohio, who always asked if Marcus had brought cigarettes, Private Henry Carson from Tennessee, who had a seemingly infinite supply of jokes, and Sergeant Paul Anderson from Wisconsin, who treated Marcus with the kind of easy camaraderie that Marcus treasured precisely because it was so rare. These men relied on supply drivers like Marcus to keep them functional. Without regular deliveries of ammunition, they might as well abandon their guns. Without food and water, they could not maintain their position. Without mail from home, their morale would collapse like a structure with its foundation removed. Marcus understood that his role, while unglamorous and largely unrecognized, was absolutely essential to military operations. The Americans were advancing because tens of thousands of soldiers in supply and support roles did their jobs competently every single day. The statistics were staggering when Marcus had time to contemplate them. The Allied forces in Europe consumed approximately 20,000 tons of supplies every single day. That number included fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, and everything else required to keep armies functioning. Moving those supplies required thousands of vehicles and tens of thousands of drivers, mechanics, and logistics personnel. For every soldier at the front line, there were approximately 7 soldiers in support roles behind them, creating a massive logistical pyramid that stretched all the way back to ports where ships arrived daily from America and Britain. Marcus had once calculated that in a typical week, he personally delivered approximately 2 tons of supplies across roughly 400 miles of driving. Multiply that by the 42 drivers in his unit, then by the hundreds of similar units operating across the European theater, and the scale became almost incomprehensible. They were ants, Marcus sometimes thought, individual ants carrying tiny loads that collectively moved mountains. The mist continued to lift and visibility improved to perhaps 400 yards. Marcus could now see the outline of a small farmhouse to his left, its roof partially caved in from some past violence. No smoke rose from the chimney, no signs of life appeared anywhere. The family who had once lived there had either fled or perished, their home now just another empty structure in a landscape full of them. Marcus wondered if they would ever return, if someone would rebuild that roof and replant those fields, or if this place would remain a monument to destruction. A sound reached his ears that did not belong to the familiar symphony of military operations. It was mechanical, but higher pitched than artillery, more urgent than the distant rumble of trucks. Marcus frowned and instinctively slowed the jeep, trying to identify the source. The sound grew louder, resolving itself into the distinctive whine of an aircraft engine under stress. That was unusual. Allied air superiority was so complete at this stage that seeing any aircraft was uncommon, and seeing a German aircraft this close to the ground in broad daylight was practically unheard of. Marcus spotted it perhaps 5 seconds later, emerging from a patch of mist about 600 yards to his right. It was a single-engine aircraft, flying barely above tree level, maybe 150 feet off the ground, moving roughly parallel to Marcus's position, but slightly ahead. The aircraft had a distinctive silhouette that Marcus recognized from the identification posters that had been plastered around every military installation. It was a Focke-Wulf 190, the primary single-seat fighter used by the German Air Force throughout the conflict. The Focke-Wulf 190 was a formidable machine by any measure. Powered by a BMW 801 radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower, it could reach speeds of 408 miles per hour and climb to 37,400 feet. Armed with 2 machine cannons and 2 heavy cannons, it had earned a reputation as one of the most effective fighters in the European theater, particularly in the hands of experienced pilots. But this particular Focke-Wulf 190 was clearly in trouble. Black smoke trailed from its engine cowling, and the aircraft wobbled slightly as it flew, the pilot apparently struggling to maintain control. Marcus watched, fascinated and apprehensive in equal measure. A damaged German aircraft this close to Allied lines meant the pilot was either trying to return to his own territory or looking for somewhere to set down before his engine failed completely. The aircraft continued parallel to the road for perhaps 10 seconds more, then began a wide, banking turn to the right. Marcus realized with a start that the turn would bring the aircraft across his path, perhaps 300 yards ahead of where the jeep currently traveled. He eased off the accelerator further, uncertain what protocol dictated in this situation. There had been no training for encountering enemy aircraft while on a supply run. His jeep carried no weapons more substantial than the M1911 pistol holstered at his waist, a weapon that would be as effective against an armored aircraft as throwing stones at a tank. The Focke-Wulf completed its turn, and Marcus could now see it more clearly as it crossed from right to left across his field of vision. The black smoke was definitely coming from the engine, and as Marcus watched, he saw flames beginning to flicker near the cowling. The pilot was going down, no question about it. The only mystery was whether he would make it to the ground in something resembling controlled flight, or whether the aircraft would simply fall from the sky like a stone dropped from a bridge. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. If the pilot managed to land the aircraft intact and survived, what was Marcus supposed to do? Attempt to take him prisoner? That seemed absurd given the circumstances. Drive away quickly and report the position to the nearest Allied unit? That made more sense but felt somehow wrong, like abandoning someone who needed help even if that someone had been moments ago an enemy combatant. The decision was taken from his hands by what happened next. The aircraft suddenly nosed down sharply, dropping perhaps 50 feet in 2 seconds before the pilot managed to level it again. They were now at maybe 100 feet altitude, close enough that Marcus could see details of the aircraft's construction. The yellow nose cone that marked it as a fighter, the faded camouflage pattern on its wings, even what looked like kill markings near the cockpit, indicating how many Allied aircraft this pilot had defeated in past encounters. Then Marcus saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Directly ahead of the struggling aircraft, perhaps 1,000 yards distant and slightly to the left of the road Marcus traveled, was an open field. It was one of the few flat, clear spaces in this area of rolling hills and scattered forests, maybe 800 yards long and 400 yards wide. And at the near end of that field, barely visible through the thinning mist, was what looked like several tents and possibly some vehicles. Marcus realized with a shock that the German pilot had spotted a forward airfield, one of the temporary bases that Allied forces set up as they advanced to reduce the distance fighter aircraft needed to travel to provide cover over advancing ground forces. The presence of such an airfield explained why a German fighter would be operating in this area, reconnaissance or possibly an attempt to harass Allied air operations. And now that damaged German fighter was heading straight for that Allied airfield, whether intentionally or simply, because it was the only suitable landing area available. The Focke-Wulf continued its descent, now at perhaps 75 feet, flames spreading along the engine cowling despite the pilot's obvious efforts to control them. Marcus watched the aircraft pass ahead of him, tracking left toward the field. He could see the airfield more clearly now. Definitely tents, at least 3 aircraft on the ground near the far end of the field, several vehicles that might be jeeps or trucks, and what looked like personnel moving between structures. Marcus made a decision that he would question for the rest of his life, a choice driven more by instinct than conscious thought. He pressed the accelerator to the floor and cranked the steering wheel hard to the left, sending the jeep lurching off the road and into the field that bordered it. The transition was violent, the jeep bouncing over the shallow ditch that separated road from field and then jolting across uneven ground that had been churned by spring rain into a morass of soft soil and standing water. The jeep's speedometer climbed, 15 miles per hour, 20-25. The little vehicle shook and rattled, the cargo in the back shifting and sliding despite the tie-downs Marcus had carefully secured that morning. Mud sprayed from the tires as they fought for traction, and twice Marcus felt the rear end start to slide before he corrected with practiced instinct. Ahead and to his left, the German aircraft continued its descent toward the Allied airfield. Marcus could see it clearly now, tracking across his field of vision at an angle that would intersect his path if he maintained his current course. The pilot was committed to landing, that much was obvious. Whether he knew he was approaching an Allied airfield or simply saw an open field and took his only chance at survival, Marcus could not guess. Marcus's plan, insofar as he had one, was simply to reach the airfield ahead of the German aircraft and warn whoever was there. A damaged enemy fighter attempting to land at an Allied base created all sorts of potential problems. Would the Germans try to take hostages? Would the pilot simply surrender? Would there be some kind of confrontation that Marcus's warning might help prevent? The jeep thundered across the field, engine screaming in protest at the sustained maximum throttle, suspension compressed almost flat as it absorbed impact after impact from the uneven ground. Marcus gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached, fighting to keep the vehicle pointed roughly toward the airfield, while simultaneously tracking the aircraft's progress from the corner of his eye. He was closing the distance. The airfield was perhaps 600 yards away now, the aircraft maybe 400 yards distant and still descending. Marcus could see figures at the airfield beginning to react, people pointing at the incoming aircraft, others running toward what might be defensive positions. In 1945, forward airfields maintained minimal defenses against air attack, relying primarily on Allied air superiority and the assumption that German aircraft would not operate this deep behind Allied lines in daylight. That assumption was being tested right now. The Focke-Wulf dropped to perhaps 40 feet, close enough to the ground that Marcus could see grass flattening in the field beneath it from the prop wash. The flames along the engine cowling had spread, and smoke now streamed behind the aircraft like a banner. The pilot had perhaps 30 seconds before the engine failed completely, or the fire reached something critical, and the entire aircraft became an uncontrollable fireball. Marcus was closing rapidly on the airfield now, close enough to see details. A windsock hanging limp in the still air, 3 P-47 Thunderbolt fighters parked in a rough line, a collection of tents that constituted the base's operational center, and perhaps 20 men in various states of reaction to the incoming emergency. Some were running toward vehicles, others toward what Marcus assumed were weapon positions, Still others simply standing and watching, with the frozen incomprehension of people whose brains had not yet caught up to what their eyes were showing them. The German aircraft leveled out at approximately 25 feet, speed reduced to perhaps 100 miles per hour. Landing gear still retracted, because the pilot either could not deploy it or had made the calculated decision that attempting to extend gear at this point would create more problems than it solved. This was going to be a belly landing, the pilot attempting to slide the aircraft across the grass in a maneuver that required extraordinary skill and more than a little luck to survive. Marcus was now perhaps 300 yards from the airfield, still racing across the field at maximum speed. The Jeep hit a particularly large bump, and for a sickening moment, all 4 tires left the ground, the vehicle airborne for perhaps 3 feet before crashing back down with the impact that Marcus felt in his teeth. The cargo in the back shifted dramatically, and Marcus heard something metal clang against something else metal, but he did not dare reduce speed to check what had broken. The Focke-Wulf was now directly ahead of Marcus and slightly to his left, maybe 200 yards distant, descending through the last 20 feet of altitude. Marcus could see the pilot's helmet through the canopy, could make out the control surfaces on the wings moving as the pilot made final adjustments, could see fuel or some other liquid streaming from underneath the fuselage, creating a visible trail in the air. And then Marcus saw it, the moment of intersection, the point where the aircraft's glide path would cross the exact patch of ground Marcus was racing toward. It happened in his mind as a kind of geometric certainty, vectors and angles resolving into a single point in space and time. If he maintained his current speed and direction, and if the aircraft maintained its current descent rate, they would reach the same place at the same moment. Later, when asked to explain his decision, Marcus would struggle to find adequate words. He had not intended to intercept the aircraft. He had not planned to position his Jeep as an obstacle in the landing path. Everything that followed happened in perhaps 3 seconds, a span of time too brief for conscious decision-making and too critical for anything except pure instinct. The aircraft dropped to 10 feet, then 5. The pilot had committed fully to the landing now, nose slightly up to reduce forward speed, the entire aircraft seemingly suspended in that eternal moment before contact with the earth. Marcus could see individual rivets on the aircraft's underside, could see the closed bomb bay doors, could see scorch marks around the engine cowling where fire had burned away paint. Marcus's hands turned the steering wheel a fraction to the right, barely a movement at all, but enough to alter the Jeep's trajectory by perhaps 10 feet. He was no longer driving around the aircraft's landing path. He was driving into it. The Focke-Wulf's tail wheel touched ground first, exactly as intended by the pilot, an initial contact point that would allow the aircraft to settle forward onto its belly while burning off speed. That contact happened perhaps 40 yards ahead of Marcus's Jeep, which was now traveling at 28 miles per hour, directly toward the landing aircraft. The aircraft's belly touched grass with a shriek of tearing metal, the force of impact sending up a cloud of dirt and debris. Without landing gear to absorb the shock, the entire airplane shuddered and slewed slightly to the right, beginning to slow but still carrying tremendous momentum. 8 tons of aircraft traveling at 90 miles per hour contained enormous kinetic energy that could not be dissipated instantly, even under the best conditions. Marcus saw the tail section sweeping toward him, an expanse of painted metal and riveted panels that grew larger with impossible speed. In that final second, some part of his brain registered the absurdity of the situation. He was about to deliberately drive his Jeep into an enemy aircraft that was attempting an emergency landing. No training manual covered this scenario. No standing order addressed this possibility. He was improvising, operating purely on instinct in a situation so unprecedented that no accumulated military wisdom offered guidance. The impact happened with a sound Marcus would never forget, a tremendous metallic crash that seemed to compress the entire world into a single point of violence. The Jeep's front bumper struck the Focke-Wulf's tail section approximately 6 feet forward of the rudder, catching the aircraft just as it completed its first 200 feet of ground slide. The timing was, in its own way, perfect. Late enough that the aircraft had slowed significantly from its initial landing speed, but early enough that it still possessed enormous momentum. What happened next defied the expectations of anyone who might have predicted the outcome of such a collision. A jeep weighing 2,350 pounds, even one traveling at 28 miles per hour, should have been simply crushed by the sliding 8-ton aircraft. Basic physics suggested that the smaller vehicle would crumple, while the larger aircraft continued largely undisturbed, perhaps with some minor damage to its tail section, but otherwise intact. But physics, as it turned out, was more complicated than simple mass calculations suggested. The jeep struck the aircraft's tail at an angle that drove its bumper up and under the horizontal stabilizer, the solid steel bar catching the lightweight aluminum structure with concentrated force at a point where the aircraft's design was optimized for air pressure from above and below, not direct horizontal impact from the side. The stabilizer crumpled, folding upward in a way that shifted the aircraft's center of resistance. Simultaneously, the impact's timing caught the aircraft at a critical moment in its landing slide. With belly already in contact with the ground and tail section suddenly struck from the side, the Focke-Wulf did what no properly functioning aircraft should do. It pivoted. The nose swung left while the tail, struck by the jeep, was forced right. The rotation was not dramatic, perhaps 15 degrees total, but it was enough to change the aircraft's orientation relative to its direction of travel, and that change in orientation proved catastrophic for the landing attempt. The Focke-Wulf's right wing, suddenly presented at an angle to its forward momentum, caught the ground with tremendous force. The wingtip dug in like a plow blade, and 8 tons of aircraft traveling at perhaps 70 miles per hour tried to rotate around that pivot point. The result was spectacular and violent. The aircraft went into an uncontrolled spin, pivoting around its embedded wingtip, while the rest of the structure whirled through 360 degrees of rotation. The spinning aircraft threw debris in all directions: pieces of wing, chunks of engine cowling, fragments of landing gear housing. The engine, already on fire, tore partially free from its mounts and tumbled separately across the field, trailing flame and smoke. The propeller, still attached to the disintegrating engine, carved furrows in the earth each time it made contact. Marcus's jeep, having delivered its impact, was thrown violently to the right by the collision. The steering wheel was ripped from Marcus's hands with force sufficient to tear skin from his palms. The jeep slewed sideways, rolled onto 2 wheels, balanced there for a moment that seemed to last forever, then crashed back down onto all 4 tires. The vehicle continued sliding sideways for perhaps 30 feet before momentum finally dissipated, and it shuddered to a stop. Marcus sat frozen in the driver's seat, hands bleeding, ears ringing from the tremendous noise of the collision. His mind struggled to process what had just happened, to assemble the fragments of sensation and memory into some kind of coherent understanding. Around him, the world seemed to move in slow motion. Pieces of aircraft were still falling from the sky, clattering onto grass and mud with sounds like discordant bells. Smoke rose from multiple points across the field where burning debris had landed, and in the middle of it all, approximately 100 feet from where Marcus sat, the remains of the Focke-Wulf 190 lay crumpled and burning. The spin had completed 3 full rotations before the aircraft's momentum was finally exhausted, and those rotations had torn the machine apart with systematic thoroughness. The wings were separated from the fuselage, both lying at unnatural angles like the arms of a broken doll. The tail section, where Marcus's jeep had first made contact, was completely severed and lay 50 feet away from the main wreckage. The cockpit was compressed and twisted, the canopy shattered into thousands of glittering fragments scattered across the grass. Marcus's first coherent thought was concern for the pilot. Despite everything, despite the fact that minutes ago this had been an enemy combatant, Marcus's immediate instinct was to render aid to another human being in distress. He fumbled for the door handle, hands shaking so badly he could barely grasp it, and pushed the door open. His legs felt like water as he climbed out of the jeep, barely able to support his weight. Behind him he heard the sound of vehicles approaching at high speed, voices shouting, the controlled chaos of military personnel responding to an emergency. But Marcus's attention was fixed on the burning wreckage, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that the pilot had survived the catastrophic disintegration of his aircraft. He took one step toward the wreckage, then another, his training fighting against his humanitarian instinct. Burning aircraft were dangerous, liable to explode if flames reached fuel tanks or ammunition. Approaching such a wreck was foolhardy at best, and potentially suicidal. But Marcus took another step anyway, unable to simply stand by while someone might be trapped and dying in that burning metal coffin. Then he saw movement. The canopy section, though shattered, had been blown partially clear of the fuselage during the spin, and climbing from the wreckage, moving with the jerky urgency of someone operating on pure survival instinct, was the pilot. He was small, Marcus's first thought, barely 5.5 feet tall and slender. His flight suit was torn and smoking, his leather helmet askew, but he was alive and moving under his own power. The pilot cleared the wreckage, staggered 3 steps, then collapsed onto the grass, rolling away from the flames with the last of his strength. Marcus ran forward, closing the distance between them, no longer thinking about protocols or proper procedures, concerned only with pulling another human being away from immediate danger. He reached the pilot, grabbed him under the arms and dragged him further from the burning wreckage, putting at least 30 feet of distance between them and the flames before stopping to check on the man's condition. Up close, Marcus could see the pilot was young, probably not much older than Marcus himself. His face was pale beneath a coating of soot and blood from a cut on his forehead. His eyes were open but unfocused, showing the telltale signs of shock and possibly concussion. He was breathing, though, and as Marcus lowered him to the ground, he saw the pilot's eyes begin to focus, awareness slowly returning as his brain caught up to the fact that he was alive and on solid ground. Other voices surrounded them now. Marcus looked up to see 6 American soldiers approaching at a run, led by a lieutenant Marcus did not recognize. The lieutenant carried a pistol drawn and pointed at the downed pilot, while the soldiers behind him spread into a loose perimeter, their own weapons at the ready. Marcus raised his hands instinctively, a gesture he immediately regretted but could not stop. A reflex born from too many interactions, where being a black man surrounded by armed white men required such demonstrations of non-threat. The lieutenant, a thin man with sharp features and captain's bars Marcus now noticed, looked from the pilot to Marcus to the wreckage and back again, his face showing the confusion of someone trying to assemble a coherent picture from fragments that made no sense. "What happened here, soldier?" he demanded, his voice carrying the tone of someone who expected immediate and complete answers. Marcus struggled to find words, struggled to explain something he barely understood himself. "Sir, I was driving supplies to the forward artillery position," he began, his voice rougher than he expected, adrenaline making speech difficult. "I saw the aircraft in trouble, saw it heading for the field. I thought I should warn you, sir. I drove across the field to get here first, and then the aircraft was landing and we collided, sir." The explanation sounded inadequate even to Marcus's own ears, a skeleton of truth that failed to capture the complexity of what had actually occurred. The lieutenant's face showed he found it equally unsatisfying. "You collided with an enemy aircraft," he repeated, his tone suggesting he thought Marcus might be suffering from shock-induced delusion. "You're telling me you drove a jeep into a landing fighter aircraft?" "Yes, sir," Marcus said, because what else could he say? "It happened very fast, sir. The aircraft was coming down and I was crossing the field and we were just there, sir, at the same point." One of the other soldiers, a sergeant with 3 stripes and a weathered face that suggested extensive combat experience, had been examining the wreckage while this exchange occurred. Now he spoke up, his voice carrying a note of wonder that bordered on disbelief. "Lieutenant, you need to see this. That jeep strike tore the tail section clean off, and look at the wing, how it's embedded in the ground. Sir, I think this private actually brought down that fighter." The lieutenant walked over to examine the wreckage more closely, leaving 2 soldiers to watch both Marcus and the now conscious German pilot. Marcus could hear the pilot breathing behind him, could hear what might have been German words spoken too softly to make out clearly. He resisted the urge to turn and look, keeping his attention on the lieutenant and trying to read what the officer's body language might tell him about what came next. The lieutenant spent perhaps 2 minutes examining the wreckage, walking a slow circle around it, while being careful to avoid the still-burning engine section. When he returned, his expression had shifted from confusion to something approaching awe mixed with uncertainty. "Private, what's your name and unit?" he asked, his voice now carrying a different tone, less accusatory and more simply curious. Private First Class. Marcus Williams, sir. 666th Quartermaster Truck Company. Marcus replied, relieved that his voice came out steady despite the trembling he felt throughout his body. Williams, the lieutenant repeated, seeming to test the name. Private Williams, I think you just did something remarkable. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Richard Patterson, commanding officer of this airfield, and I've been in the air service for 12 years. I've seen a lot of aircraft brought down by a lot of different means, but I have never, in all my experience, seen one brought down by a jeep. Marcus did not know how to respond to that, so he simply said, "Thank you, sir," which seemed inadequate but better than silence. Behind them, the German pilot was being helped to his feet by two soldiers who kept their weapons trained on him throughout. The pilot swayed slightly but remained standing, his eyes tracking around the field, taking in his surroundings with what Marcus recognized as the cataloguing gaze of someone assessing their situation and options. When the pilot's eyes met Marcus's, something passed between them, some acknowledgement that Marcus could not quite name. Not gratitude exactly, but perhaps recognition that Marcus had pulled him from the wreckage when he might have left him to burn. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson turned to address the pilot in what Marcus assumed was German, words Marcus could not understand, but which carried the universal tone of military authority questioning a subordinate. The pilot responded in accented but clear English, his voice younger than Marcus expected. Lieutenant Heinrich Müller, 2nd Fighter Wing, based at Rhein-Hopsten. I request to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. You'll be treated properly, Patterson assured him, then turned back to his soldiers. Get him to the medical tent, have his injuries assessed, and keep him under guard. Sergeant Morrison, I want a full report on that wreckage. Salvage what intelligence we can from it, and get some photographs before we clear it away. He paused, then added, and someone get me a photographer up here. I want documentation of this. The next 2 hours passed in a blur for Marcus. His hands were treated in the medical tent, the torn skin on his palms cleaned and bandaged by a medic who kept asking questions about how the collision felt from inside the jeep. Questions Marcus struggled to answer because the actual moment of impact remained somewhat fragmentary in his memory. His jeep was examined by mechanics who declared it remarkably intact, given what it had just experienced. Damaged front bumper, cracked windshield frame, and what looked like a bent tie rod, but nothing that could not be repaired given a few hours and access to spare parts. Patterson interviewed Marcus extensively, taking notes in a small leather-bound notebook, asking for details about his route that morning, what time he first spotted the aircraft, his exact speed and position when the collision occurred, everything Marcus could recall about the sequence of events. The questions were not hostile, but they were thorough, and Marcus recognized this as an officer trying to assemble an official record of something unprecedented. A photographer arrived, a corporal from the Public Information Office carrying a speed graphic camera, and Marcus found himself posing next to the wreckage while the photographer captured image after image from various angles. Then photos with Marcus standing beside his damaged jeep, then photos with Marcus and Lieutenant Colonel Patterson together. The photographer took over 60 exposures, changing film holders multiple times, determined to document this incident thoroughly. This is going to make the Stars and Stripes for sure, the photographer said at one point, referring to the military newspaper that served American forces throughout the European theater. Private brings down enemy fighter with jeep, that's front page material right there. But Marcus noticed something as the morning progressed, a pattern in how people referred to him and the incident. The private who brought down the fighter, they said. Not the black private, not the colored driver, just the private. It was subtle, but after years of having his race be the first and often only relevant detail about him in military contexts, the absence of such references felt striking. Lieutenant Heinrich Müller was being treated in a separate section of the medical tent. His injuries apparently minor, some bruising, the cut on his forehead which required 6 stitches, and what the medics suspected might be a cracked rib, but nothing requiring immediate evacuation to a rear hospital. Marcus glimpsed him once through the tent opening, the German pilot sitting on a cot looking small and young, and very much like what he was. A defeated combatant far from home in a conflict that was clearly ending and not in his favor. Around midday, Marcus finally received permission to complete his original mission, delivering supplies to the forward artillery position. His jeep had been temporarily repaired, the damaged bumper straightened enough to no longer interfere with driving, the cracked windshield frame reinforced with wire. The cargo had survived the collision remarkably intact, only one crate of ammunition showing any damage, and that merely superficial splintering of the wooden exterior. As Marcus prepared to depart, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson approached him one final time. "Private Williams," he said, his tone carrying a formality that suggested official pronouncement, "I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star for your actions this morning. What you did was extraordinary, and while I'm not entirely certain it was intentional rather than the result of remarkable timing, the outcome is undeniable. You brought down an enemy aircraft using a jeep, which is something I'm confident has never been done before and will probably never be done again." Marcus did not know what to say to that. The Bronze Star was awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement in a combat zone, and while what he had done certainly qualified as unusual, he was not certain it qualified as heroic. He had been trying to warn the airfield, had found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time, and had made a split-second decision that happened to work out. That did not feel like heroism so much as dumb luck combined with good reflexes. But you did not question a lieutenant colonel's decision to recommend you for a medal, so Marcus simply said, "Thank you, sir. I was just doing my duty, sir." "Well, you did it remarkably well," Patterson replied with something that might have been a smile. "Now go deliver those supplies. Those artillery boys have been waiting long enough." Marcus climbed back into his battered jeep, started the engine, which caught on the second try, and carefully turned back toward the road. As he drove away from the airfield, he glanced in his rearview mirror and saw them already at work on the wreckage, soldiers with cutting torches and tools, beginning the process of dismantling the destroyed Focke-Wulf 190 and removing it from the field. The rest of the drive to the artillery position was uneventful, exactly the kind of routine supply run Marcus had been executing for months. When he arrived, the men were surprised by the damage to his jeep, and the story he told seemed to stretch credibility to its breaking point. Sergeant Paul Anderson listened with increasing amazement, then said, "Williams, if I didn't know you to be the most honest man in this whole army, I'd call you the biggest liar I ever met. You brought down a fighter plane with your jeep. That's the craziest thing I've heard since this whole conflict started. But the bullet holes in the windshield frame, the bent bumper, and the overall appearance of a vehicle that had very recently been in a significant collision lent credibility to Marcus's account." By the time he departed to return to his unit headquarters, the men at the artillery position were already planning how they would tell this story in letters home, and in the inevitable post-conflict reminiscences. Marcus's return journey passed without incident, but his mind churned through the morning's events, trying to process what had happened and what it might mean. He thought about the collision itself, about that moment of impact when physics and timing had combined to produce an outcome nobody could have predicted. He thought about Lieutenant Heinrich Müller climbing from the wreckage, a young man who might have died if circumstances had been slightly different. He thought about Lieutenant Colonel Patterson's recommendation for a Bronze Star, and wondered if such recognition would materialize or if it would disappear into the bureaucratic machinery that sometimes lost paperwork and forgot promises. When Marcus arrived back at his unit headquarters in mid-afternoon, word had already preceded him. Captain Robert Henderson, his commanding officer, was waiting with an expression Marcus had never seen on the officer's face before. Something like pride, mixed with confusion, mixed with the beginning of respect. "Williams," Henderson said without preamble, "I just got off the field telephone with Lieutenant Colonel Patterson. He told me what happened this morning. Is it true?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, because what else could he say? "I collided with a German aircraft that was attempting an emergency landing at the forward airfield near my route." Henderson shook his head slowly, a gesture of wonderment rather than disapproval. "In 23 years of military service, Williams, I have never heard of anything like this. You understand that what you did this morning was completely unprecedented." "I'm beginning to understand that, sir," Marcus said carefully. "Patterson is recommending you for the Bronze Star," Henderson continued, "and I'm going to support that recommendation. But more than that, Williams, you've done something significant for this unit. The 666th has always done its job well, but we've never received much recognition for it, because supply and transport doesn't make headlines. What you did this morning is going to put our unit on the map, is going to show people what the 666 is capable of. I want you to know that I'm proud of you, and I'm proud to have you serving in this unit. It was the most praise Marcus had ever received from a commanding officer, and coming from Henderson, who had always maintained such careful professional distance, it felt particularly significant. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion he had not expected, a feeling that combined relief and pride, and a sudden overwhelming sense of being seen, truly seen as a competent soldier, rather than just another black driver fulfilling a necessary but unappreciated function. The story spread through military channels with remarkable speed. By the next day, Marcus found himself being interviewed by a correspondent from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, who took additional photographs and asked questions that covered not just the incident itself, but Marcus's background, his journey to the military, his experiences serving in a segregated unit. The correspondent, a staff sergeant named Thomas Bradley from Boston, seemed genuinely interested in the broader context of Marcus's story. "Private Williams," Bradley said at one point during the interview, "you're aware that what you've done is going to be read about by millions of people, right? This is the kind of story that plays well back home. Young American soldier, quick thinking, unusual circumstances, positive outcome. It's got everything, but I want to make sure we tell it right. What do you want people to know about what happened?" Marcus thought about that question carefully. "I want people to know that I was just doing my job," he finally said. "I drive supplies where they need to go day after day, and thousands of other soldiers do the same thing. We're not looking for glory or recognition. We're just trying to do our part to end this conflict and go home. What happened with the aircraft was unusual, but it doesn't make me special. It just makes me lucky." Bradley nodded slowly. "That's a good answer. Humble, people will appreciate that. But you should know, Williams, that for a lot of folks back home, especially folks who look like you, this story is going to mean something more. You're going to be held up as an example, whether you want that or not." Marcus understood what Bradley meant, understood the weight of representation that came with being a black soldier who had achieved something noteworthy. In a military that remained segregated, where black soldiers were largely relegated to service roles and their capabilities constantly questioned, any achievement by a black soldier became ammunition in the larger civil rights struggle that was brewing throughout American society. Marcus had not asked for that burden, but he recognized it was being placed on his shoulders nonetheless. The article appeared in Stars and Stripes 3 days later, on March 30th, under the headline, "Jeep Driver Brings Down Enemy Fighter in Unprecedented Action." The article was detailed and largely accurate, though Marcus noticed it emphasized the dramatic elements of the story, while somewhat downplaying the role of luck and timing in the outcome. The accompanying photograph showed Marcus standing beside his damaged Jeep with the wreckage of the Focke-Wulf visible in the background, and Marcus thought he looked younger in the photograph than he felt, his face showing nervousness despite his attempt to appear confident. The story was picked up by civilian newspapers in the United States within days. Marcus began receiving letters from home, his mother writing that she had read about him in the Detroit Free Press, his sister Clara writing that all her teachers at school were talking about her brother, the hero. Friends he had not heard from in years sent letters, some congratulatory, some asking for details beyond what the newspapers had reported, all of them expressing amazement that quiet Marcus Williams from their Detroit neighborhood had done something so remarkable. But the most unexpected letter came from Lieutenant Heinrich Müller, the German pilot. The letter had been written in careful English and passed through military censors before reaching Marcus, so some portions were blacked out, but the core message remained intact. Müller wrote that he wanted to express his gratitude for Marcus pulling him from the wreckage, an action Müller believed had saved his life, given how quickly the fire had spread after his extraction. He wrote that he bore no ill will toward Marcus for the collision that had brought down his aircraft, understanding that such were the chances of conflict. And he wrote that he hoped both of them would survive the conflict and return to their homes, and that perhaps someday, in a world at peace, they might meet again under better circumstances. Marcus read that letter multiple times, struck by its tone of reconciliation and humanity. Here was a man who had been his enemy, who he had defeated through the strangest of circumstances, reaching across the divide of their opposing sides to acknowledge their shared humanity. Marcus drafted a reply, struggling to find the right words, eventually settling on a simple expression of reciprocal good wishes and hope that Muller's injuries were healing. He never knew if Muller received that reply, never knew what became of the German pilot after he was transferred from the field hospital to a prisoner of war camp somewhere in the rear areas. April passed into May, and the conflict in Europe reached its conclusion. The German military collapsed, the regime that had started the conflict fell, and across Europe, soldiers began the complex process of transitioning from conflict to occupation and eventually to demobilization. Marcus continued driving supplies through it all, his role unchanged even as the nature of what he transported shifted from ammunition and combat rations to reconstruction supplies and displaced persons relief materials. The Bronze Star recommendation moved through official channels with the characteristic slowness of military bureaucracy. Marcus was interviewed 3 more times by various officers seeking to verify details for the official record. Witnesses from the airfield were questioned. The wreckage of the Focke-Wulf was examined by specialists trying to confirm the exact sequence of events that led to its destruction. And through it all, Marcus simply continued doing his job, driving his jeep, hauling supplies, being the unglamorous but essential cog in the military machine that he had always been. The medal was finally awarded on June 15, 1945, in a ceremony at unit headquarters. Captain Henderson read the citation, which described in formal military language Marcus's extraordinary achievement in bringing down an enemy aircraft through quick thinking and decisive action, demonstrating the highest standards of military bearing and contributing to the Allied victory. Marcus stood at attention while the medal was pinned to his uniform, and for the first time in his military service, he felt truly seen and valued as a soldier, rather than merely tolerated as a necessary component of a segregated army. But the most significant impact of the incident was more subtle and harder to quantify. Marcus noticed a change in how other soldiers, particularly white soldiers from other units, interacted with him. Where before he had often been invisible, just another black driver in a supply truck, now he was that guy who brought down the fighter with his jeep. It was a small change, but Marcus felt it acutely. People listened when he spoke. Officers asked his opinions. His competence was assumed rather than questioned. The 666th Quartermaster Truck Company began receiving recognition as well. A unit that had operated in obscurity for 2 years suddenly found itself mentioned in dispatches, praised by senior officers, held up as an example of the professionalism and capability of service units. Captain Henderson told Marcus privately that recruitment of black soldiers into quartermaster units had increased measurably since the story appeared in Stars and Stripes, suggesting that the incident had helped change perceptions about what black soldiers could accomplish. Marcus remained with the 666th through the summer and fall of 1945, continuing to drive supplies as the military presence in Europe gradually reduced. He was finally discharged on January 12, 1946, having served 2 years and 5 months. He returned to Detroit carrying his Bronze Star, his honorable discharge papers, and a collection of memories that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The post-conflict years were kind to Marcus Williams. He used the GI Bill to attend Wayne State University, earning a degree in mechanical engineering in 1950. He married in 1951 to a woman named Dorothy, who had served as a nurse during the conflict and understood something of what he had experienced. They had 3 children, all of whom heard the story of their father and the German aircraft countless times growing up. Though Marcus always told it with careful humility, emphasizing luck and timing over any claims of heroism. Marcus worked for General Motors for 38 years, eventually rising to become a senior engineer in their truck division. He never forgot that his path to that career had been opened by military service, by the GI Bill benefits that segregated American society had been reluctant to extend to black veterans, by the slow erosion of racial barriers that continued throughout the 1950s and 60s. He attended civil rights marches in Detroit, contributed to organizations fighting for equality, and told anyone who would listen that the military's desegregation in 1948 had proven what he had always known, that competence and courage had nothing to do with the color of a person's skin. The story of Marcus Williams and the German fighter became something of a legend within military circles, repeated in officer training schools as an example of how extraordinary outcomes can result from ordinary soldiers simply doing their jobs in extraordinary circumstances. The official military record was eventually deposited in the National Archives, where researchers and historians could access the detailed documentation of the incident, complete with photographs, witness statements, and technical analysis of how a 2,000-pound Jeep could bring down an 8,000-pound aircraft. Heinrich Müller survived the conflict and returned to Germany, where he worked as a commercial airline pilot for Lufthansa for 30 years. He married, had 4 children, and lived a quiet life in Frankfurt. He never forgot the young American soldier who had pulled him from burning wreckage. And in 1983, at age 59, he wrote another letter to Marcus, this one tracked down through veterans organizations and delivered 38 years after their first and only meeting. The letter spoke of Müller's life, his career, his children. It spoke of his gratitude for having survived, for having been given the chance to live and build and create rather than dying in a burning aircraft at age 21, and it invited Marcus, if he ever found himself in Germany, to visit, to meet under the peaceful circumstances Müller had hoped for in that first letter, written from a prisoner of war camp so many years before. Marcus did visit, in 1984, traveling to Frankfurt with Dorothy for a trip that combined tourism with a meeting that both men had wondered about for nearly 4 decades. They met at Müller's home, 2 old men looking at each other and seeing the young soldiers they had once been, enemies for a morning who had been connected by one impossible moment of intersecting trajectories. They talked for hours, comparing their memories of that morning, filling in details each had not known about the other's experience. Müller described his aircraft catching fire over Allied territory, his desperate search for somewhere to land, his relief at spotting the field, and his focus on simply surviving the next 60 seconds. He had not known it was an Allied airfield until after landing, had not seen Marcus's Jeep until the moment of impact, had thought in that instant that he was about to die. "When your vehicle struck my aircraft," Müller said in his accented English, "I thought it was intentional, that you had deliberately driven into my landing path to prevent me from reaching the ground intact. I thought you were trying to kill me. It was only later, after I was pulled from the wreckage, that I realized you were trying to warn the airfield and simply found yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or perhaps the right place at the right time, depending on one's perspective." Marcus smiled at that. "I've spent 40 years trying to understand if what I did was intentional or accidental," he admitted. "The truth is, I'm still not entirely sure. In that final second, I turned the wheel slightly to put myself in your path. Was I trying to intercept you? Was I simply misjudging the distance? I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I'm glad you survived, and I'm glad we both made it home." They remained in contact through letters after that meeting, an unlikely friendship between 2 men whose lives had intersected for perhaps 10 minutes on a March morning in 1945, but who had been connected by that intersection ever since. When Müller passed away in 1998 at age 76, his daughter wrote to Marcus describing how her father had often told the story of the American soldier in the Jeep, how that story had shaped Müller's understanding of chance and fate and the fine line between life and death. Marcus Williams lived to the age of 89, passing away in 2015 in Detroit, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press recounted his achievement from March 1945, describing him as the only American soldier in World War II to bring down an enemy aircraft using a Jeep. The Bronze Star he earned was donated to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where it remains on display alongside a photograph of young Marcus standing beside his battered Jeep, with the wreckage of a Focke-Wulf 190 visible in the background. The incident has been analyzed extensively by military historians and aviation experts, all attempting to understand exactly how such an unlikely outcome occurred. The consensus suggests that a combination of factors created the perfect conditions: the aircraft's already damaged state, the precise timing of the collision at a critical moment during landing, the angle of impact that destabilized the aircraft's orientation, and the pilot's inevitable loss of control once the landing sequence was disrupted. Any one of those factors absent, and the outcome would likely have been completely different. Some have questioned whether the incident truly qualifies as Marcus bringing down the aircraft, arguing that the fighter was already destroyed by engine fire and that the collision merely hastened its inevitable crash. Others counter that the aircraft might have landed intact despite its damage, and that Marcus's intervention directly caused the catastrophic spin that destroyed it. The debate continues in military history journals and aviation forums, where experts pass the available evidence and construct elaborate analyses of vectors and forces and probabilities. But for Marcus Williams himself, such debates missed the essential truth of what happened that morning. He had been a young soldier trying to do his job, who had found himself in an unprecedented situation and who had made a split-second decision that happened to work out. Whether that decision was tactically sound or remarkably lucky, whether he deserved credit for bringing down the aircraft, or simply for surviving an unlikely collision, these questions seemed less important to Marcus than the simple fact that both he and Heinrich Müller had survived to go home, to build lives, to become something more than just combatants in a terrible conflict. In the broader context of the Second World War, the incident was vanishingly small, a footnote to a massive conflict that involved millions of soldiers and resulted in tens of millions of deaths. But for Marcus Williams, for Heinrich Müller, for the men of the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company, for the military historians who study unusual combat actions, and for the readers who encounter this story decades later, it remains significant precisely because it was so impossible, so unlikely, so perfectly timed that it seems almost fictional. The Jeep Marcus drove that morning, vehicle number 273, survived the conflict and was eventually shipped back to the United States as surplus military equipment. It was purchased at auction in 1947 by a farmer in Iowa who used it for 17 years before selling it to a neighbor. That neighbor's son, a military history enthusiast, eventually discovered the Jeep's wartime service record and undertook a complete restoration, returning it to its 1945 configuration, complete with the unit markings of the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company. That restored Jeep appeared at military vehicle shows throughout the Midwest in the 1990s and 2000s, where its current owner would recount the story of Marcus Williams and the German fighter to anyone who would listen. The Jeep was eventually donated to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., where it sits today in a display about black soldiers' contributions during the Second World War, with Marcus Williams's Bronze Star certificate and several photographs documenting his service and the famous collision. The incident has also taken on symbolic significance in discussions of African American military service. Marcus Williams became one of many black soldiers whose achievements helped chip away at the racist assumptions that had justified military segregation. When President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, desegregating the military, he cited evidence that black soldiers had served with distinction and capability equal to their white counterparts. Marcus Williams's unusual achievement was part of that accumulating evidence, one more data point in the slow, painful process of proving what should never have needed proving: that courage, competence, and capability were distributed without regard to race. For the students and scholars who study this period, Marcus Williams's story offers insights into multiple aspects of wartime experience. It illuminates the role of service and support units, the largely invisible soldiers who kept armies supplied and functional. It demonstrates how segregation operated within the military, creating separate but supposedly equal units that were in practice relegated to less prestigious roles. It shows how individual achievement could begin to erode systemic racism, even if progress was frustratingly slow. And it provides a deeply human story of two young men, enemies by circumstance, connected by one impossible moment. The forward airfield where the incident occurred was abandoned within weeks of the conflict's end, the temporary structures dismantled, and the land returned to agricultural use. Today, A Belgian farmer grows wheat and barley on that field, largely unaware of the extraordinary event that unfolded there 8 decades ago. No marker commemorates the spot, no plaque explains what happened. It is simply a field, like thousands of others across Europe where momentous and mundane events alike have occurred and been forgotten by all except those with reason to remember. But in the memories of those who served, in the official records carefully preserved in archives, in the stories told by families who remember their veteran relatives, in the exhibits of museums dedicated to preserving this history, Marcus Williams and his impossible achievement endure. The story has been retold countless times in books and articles and documentaries, each retelling emphasizing different aspects depending on the teller's purpose and perspective. Some focus on the technical improbability, analyzing the physics of the collision with the precision of aerospace engineers. Others emphasize the racial dimensions, examining what it meant for a black soldier to achieve something noteworthy in a segregated military. Still others concentrate on the human elements, the relationship between Marcus and Heinrich, the letters they exchanged, their eventual meeting in Frankfurt. Each perspective reveals different truths, different layers of meaning in an incident that lasted only seconds but resonated for decades. For Marcus Williams himself, the meaning of that March morning evolved over his lifetime. In the immediate aftermath, it was simply a shocking experience that had happened almost too quickly to comprehend. In the months and years that followed, it became a source of pride, evidence that he had made a meaningful contribution despite the limitations placed on him by segregation. Later, it became a teaching moment, a story he told his children and grandchildren to illustrate the randomness of fate and the importance of doing one's duty regardless of recognition. But in his final years, Marcus spoke of the incident with a kind of philosophical reflection, seeing it as emblematic of larger truths about conflict and humanity. In an interview conducted when he was 85 years old, he said something that perhaps captures the essence better than any amount of technical analysis or historical examination. That morning I was just a kid trying to do my job. Heinrich was just a kid trying to survive. We found ourselves on opposite sides of a terrible conflict, and for a few seconds our paths crossed in the most literal way possible. But what I remember most is not the collision, not the wreckage, not even the medal. What I remember is pulling him from that burning aircraft and seeing his eyes, seeing another young man who was scared and hurt and far from home just like me. In that moment we weren't enemies. We were just two people trying to survive something bigger than both of us. That sentiment, expressed with the wisdom of age and distance, perhaps explains why this story has endured when countless other wartime incidents have faded into obscurity. It speaks to something fundamental about human experience, about how individual stories illuminate larger truths, about how the most extraordinary moments can arise from the most ordinary circumstances, about how connections forged in conflict can transcend the hatreds that created that conflict in the first place. The statistical probability of what happened that morning has been calculated by various researchers, each arriving at slightly different numbers depending on their assumptions, but all agreeing that the odds were astronomically low. One analysis suggested that the probability of a supply vehicle and a damaged enemy aircraft arriving at the same point at the same time with the exact timing needed to cause the observed outcome was approximately 1 in several million. Others have calculated even longer odds, emphasizing the multiple variables that all needed to align perfectly. But probabilities and statistics, while interesting from an analytical perspective, somehow miss the essential reality of what occurred. It happened, despite the long odds, despite the improbability, despite every reason to expect a different outcome. It happened. Marcus Williams drove his jeep across that field, the German fighter descended toward that same point, and metal struck metal with perfect timing to create an outcome that no planning could have predicted and no amount of skill alone could have executed. In the end, that is perhaps the most important lesson of Marcus Williams and his impossible achievement. That history is shaped not just by grand strategies and massive forces, but also by individual moments, by split-second decisions, by the intersection of circumstances that create opportunities for the extraordinary to emerge from the ordinary. Wars are won by supply chains and industrial production, by strategic planning and tactical execution, but they are experienced and remembered through individual stories, like Marcus Williams driving his Jeep across a Belgian field on a misty March morning. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.